In this video, we're going to look at the django-vite package, which can help integrate vite.js into your Django projects. So this package can help with working with Vite assets inside the Django project, and specifically we're going to look at TailwindCSS version 4.0. Now you can see that this was released fairly recently, a couple of months ago at the time of recording. We're going to set up django-vite to handle the process of bundling Tailwind version 4 along with the new ways to do that, based on the Tailwind classes that we're actually using in a Django project, and along the way we're going to explore some configuration for Vite.js itself and how you can use that alongside your Django static assets. Now before we get started, if you want to support this channel, check out this Ko-fi page that we have here, and thank you very much to everyone who has supported the channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. Now to get started, let's look at installing django-vite. So what we need to do here is go down to this installation section, and there's a link to this page below the video, and we can copy this pip install command. And this will also work if you're using something like uv as well. We can paste this in here, and the equivalent for that would be something like uv add django-vite. Once that's installed, we have it ready to go. And what we're going to do is look at this project that we have. Now we have a static directory here, and it contains a JS folder with two simple JavaScript files here, main.js, and this is going to be the entry point or the input to our Vite bundling process. And all we're doing in this file is importing a function called sayHello, and we have a single console log, and we also call this function here, and that is defined in a different module, which is this one here called important.js. And all that does is simply console log as well. This is just going to be the starting point for how we actually integrate Vite, and then we'll move on to doing this with Tailwind version 4. Now if we go back to the GitHub page here, what we can do is add django-vite to the installed apps of this Django application. So let's go to settings.py, and let's scroll down here and add that. And we can do that right at the bottom. Once we've done that, what we're going to do in the file system here is create a vite.config file at the root directory, and that's going to be called vite.config.js. We can then copy the snippet of code from the GitHub page. So let's have a look here. Under this section here, let's copy this code that we have, and we're going to change this up a little bit to make it work with this project. As you can see here, we can remove these ellipses, and what we have is a function here called define_config, and that's specified by the Vite package. So at the top of this file, let's bring that import in from Vite. So we're importing define_config, and that's used here in this starter code. And we have a base directory set to /static. Now if we go to settings.py, this has to match one of the settings in the Django project. And let me try and find that just now. It's the static URL setting. And if we go to the GitHub page here, we set the base option to the same as the Django static URL setting. So it's going to tell you how to configure django-vite here. We also set the build.out directory path to where we want the assets to be compiled. So right now it's resolving to a directory called assets. And that's what we want here. We don't have that at the root of this application, but that's where we want the actual compiled assets to be stored. So if we go back to the Vite config file, all we need to do is import this resolve function from the path module in Node.js. So again, at the top here, let's import resolve. And basically when we run the vite build command, we want to send the built assets to this directory. So that's the purpose of the outer property. And then we have rollup options here. Now at this point I want to highlight the basic features that Vite provides in a project. So let's go to the Vite documentation. Now Vite is a build tool that aims to provide a faster and leaner development experience for modern web projects, but it consists of two major parts. Number one, we have a dev server, and this provides, among other things, extremely fast hot module replacement. So automatically reloading things when things are changed in your source code. So that's a server specific to development, and we also have a build command. And that is going to bundle your code using the rollup package in JavaScript. So that's pre-configured to output highly optimized static assets for production. So rollup is what's used to actually bundle the code. And if you go back to the config file here, we can specify options for that using the rollup options property. Now the input here is where we can specify different entry points, and we're only going to have one at this point in the video. So let's change the unique key here. And I'm going to define this as just test for now. And then we provide the path to that asset. Now I'm going to use the resolve function that we saw earlier on, so let's copy that. And what we're going to resolve here is in the static directory, and then it's the JS subdirectory, and it's main.js. That's going to be the entry point. So let's specify that link here, static.js, and then it's main.js. So the idea is that when we build the assets, we're going to take this file here as the entry point, and Vite is going to then bundle that and then output the final bundle to this assets directory. And that's going to be important later on when we actually use this to take TailwindCSS and bundle that into an optimized bundle that we can then use in production. Now we need an actual project and we need to install Vite here. So what I'm going to do on the command line is run the npm init command, and we specify -y, which means it doesn't need to take in options from the user. And what that's going to do is create on the left hand side a package.json file, and that's going to contain the JavaScript modules that we need for this project. We can then install Vite itself, and that can be done as a development dependency with the -d flag. So we're going to install Vite here, and that's going to add that to the development dependencies in this package.json. Now, of course, for this to work, you actually need to have npm and Node.js installed. So when you're working with these kind of build chains, you are going to need Node.js installed in development, but you don't need this on the server because the idea is that you produce the bundle and the bundle is then shipped to your server, but you don't actually need Node.js on the server. So this is a development step that's done before you actually push the code into production. So we've now added Vite here. Let's clear the terminal. And we can see in package.json, we have Vite under development dependencies. We're going to add some scripts now. So I'm going to have a dev script here, and that's going to be very simple. We're just going to call the Vite command. So we can put Vite in here, and let's have a second script here. I'm going to copy this down, and we're going to have a final script here called build, and that will run, instead of just Vite, the Vite build command. Now you might be wondering what these do. Let's go to the Vite documentation. When you run the Vite command, it just starts the dev server, and the Vite build command here is going to build for production, including bundling those assets using rollup. Now we can try this out, so let's go back to VS Code, and on the terminal we can run npm run dev, and that's going to run the Vite command. And I'm getting an error here because I've got a trailing comma in the script. So let's try this again, npm run dev, and hopefully we're going to see this running now. Now notice it started a dev server here on localhost port 5173. So the Vite server is then running, so when you're developing the Django application, for example in a template, and you're adding classes from Tailwind or any kind of other features like that, this is going to pick up any changes and rebuild the bundle in development, so you don't need to worry about that. Now if we stop that server and instead run npm run build, what's going to happen here is it's going to produce this assets directory. So why is this happening? If we go to the Vite config, the out directory for the bundled resources here in the build step is this one here, it's called assets. So in the assets directory, let's have a look at what we have. Now notice it's produced a manifest.json file, and we also have this file here called test, and then there's a hash.js. I'm not sure if that's a hash actually, it's just a bunch of random characters, but let's have a look at this. And notice it's got the console log statements that we had in our entry point, which is the main.js file, including this one here, and this one was imported from another module. So it resolves all of the imports and it produces this final bundle here, and notice that here. And all the manifest is doing is it's taking the input file and it can map that to the output file, in other words, mapping it to that built asset. And django-vite is going to use this when you reference these files to actually replace this reference with the correct bundled asset. Now here we have an assets directory that contains an assets subdirectory. We can change that again by going back to the vite.config file. Here we have the out directory set to assets, but there's another setting you can use, and that's the assets directory. So I can change that, for example, to something like django-assets if we want to change the name of that subdirectory. And then let's go back to the terminal and run the build command. Once that's completed, if we go to here, you can see the subdirectory is now called Django-assets. Now let's see this in our project. What we're going to do is go to settings.py, and we need to tell Django where these bundled final assets are going to be placed. So we're going to do that using a setting here called static files directories. And we can set that to the assets directory that we have. So it's the base directory and then an assets subdirectory under that. And while we're here, let's also add a static root. And we're going to set that to a static files directory. We can now configure django-vite to serve this content from the assets directory. And remember, it's going to take the name of the raw file here and it's going to map it to the correct asset using the manifest. So django-vite will handle that transparently, but we need to set that up using some of the configuration. So let's go back to the GitHub page for django-vite. If we go down to these assets here, what we can do is go to the configuration, and we're going to copy this here, and I'm going to go back to settings.py, and let's go to the very bottom, and we're going to paste this in. So django-vite, this is the settings for, or the configuration for that package. And dev mode is going to be set to true or false. Now, one thing you can do is also set it to the value of debug. So in development, that's going to be true. In production, it's going to be false. What does this dev mode setting mean? Let's go back to the GitHub page here and we can scroll down. So this Boolean defines if you want to include assets in development mode or production mode. When you're in development mode, the assets are included as modules using the Vite.js web server. And that's going to enable hot module replacement, in other words, auto reloading when things change. But in production mode, you certainly don't want that. The assets that are there going to be included as standard assets, so the Vite.js web server is not going to run. and these will just be included like default Django static files. And that means that your assets must be compiled with vite.js beforehand using that vite build command. Now, once we've added that setting, what we can do is add the template tags into the base HTML template. So let's copy this here and let's go back to our project. Now, inside this project, I have a core Django application that contains some templates. We have a base.html. Right at the top of that, what we're going to do is load the django-vite template tags. And we have a couple of extra ones as well. So in the head element, we need to include the hot module replacement client. Let's go back here and just in the head element, we can paste this in. That's going to enable that automatic reloading, that hot module replacement. And it does so by adding a script tag to include the vite.js HMR client. And this tag will include the script only if django-vite dev mode is set to true. In other words, only in development. And finally, we can add any paths to our assets. And we do that using the vite asset template tag. So let's copy that. And we can go back to base.html and paste that into the head tag. Now we need to replace this with an actual path to our asset. So if we go back to the vite config, this was the path here, static/js/main.js. So we can actually paste that into this asset path here. And we should find that it matches what we see here in the manifest. So you can see that same key here for the manifest. So that's what we're pointing vite to. And what that's going to do essentially is it's going to replace this reference here with whatever it's mapped to here in the manifest. In other words, it's going to replace it with this file here. And that's the bundled and optimized code that you see here. Now I want to test this out, so let's go back to the server at the bottom, and I need to save settings.py, and then we can run the npm run dev command. So we're not going to run the build command this time, we're going to run the dev command. That starts the vite.js web server. And let's open a new terminal on VS Code. And on this new terminal, we're going to start the Django development server. Now, once that's started, we want to see that the asset here is loaded and that those console logs appear on the browser. So I'm going to go to the page that's serving up this index.html file that extends the base template. And it's this one here. And then we can open up the developer tools and look at the console. So let's go to the console here and notice that we have the two hello statements. These are coming from the JS files and they're being served by django-vite using this vite asset template tag. Now what I can do if we go to main.js is we can change the content of this file. So what I'm going to do is just make this a little bit smaller. And when we change that and save it, notice that the page reloads automatically. So if I try that again and just save that, the page is going to reload and that's vite.js's hot module replacement kicking in. So whenever you change your templates or your static assets, it's going to automatically replace that content. Now I want to move on to something a bit more interesting than these console log statements. Let's see how to install and bundle Tailwind version 4 using django-vite. Now we did some TailwindCSS videos before on the installation and bundling process, but things have changed a little bit in version 4. So what I'm going to do is go to the documentation, and I'll leave a link to this page below the video. TailwindCSS works by scanning all of your HTML files, JavaScript components, and any other templates for class names, and it generates the corresponding styles and writes them to a static CSS file. And for installation, we have a section on using Vite, and TailwindCSS version 4 has introduced this Vite plugin, and that's going to make things a little bit easier. So let's copy the npm install command, and we can go back to our application, and I'm going to paste that command in, and it's going to install TailwindCSS as well as the Vite plugin. Now Vite has many plugins, including for front-end frameworks like React and Vue.js, and it now has one for Vite as well. So what we can do after we've installed this is go to our static directory, and we're going to create a CSS subdirectory here. And within that, I want to create a file that I'm just going to call main.css. And the reason we're creating this, if we go back to the documentation here, is that we're going to import TailwindCSS on step 3 here. So let's copy this import. And if you remember before, we had different Tailwind directives being used here. This has been simplified in version 4. All we need to do is import TailwindCSS like this in a CSS file that's going to be imported into our entry point. So we'll do that in a second, but we also have to do step 2, and that's configuring the Tailwind Vite plugin. So notice in the Vite config file here, we can import TailwindCSS, and that's using that plugin here. And then in the plugins section of define config, we just instantiate that. So let's go back to our Vite config file. And at the top of this file, we're going to bring the import in, and then we can define at the bottom here a plugins section. And that's going to be a JavaScript array of plugins, and we're going to instantiate the TailwindCSS Vite plugin. Now, once we've done that, we can go back to the documentation. We've already done this import, so we can move on to the build process on step 4. Now, the build process is run with whatever's configured in package.json, and it's going to be npm run dev like we have here. But what we need to do is we need to point this entry point, and it's the one here at main.js. We need to actually include the TailwindCSS file. So just to make things a little bit easier to read, I'm going to close everything here. In main.js, notice we're importing the sayHello function. We now have in the static directory a main.css file that imports the TailwindCSS module. We want to actually import in the JavaScript file this package here. Now in order to do that, let's go back to main.js, which remember is the entry point for our Vite build process. And we're going to add another import to this. So we're going to import the CSS file. So let's go back a directory. And then in the CSS directory, we have a main.css file. So we're in this JavaScript subdirectory, we go back a directory, and then in the CSS one, we have this main.css. That's what we're importing here. Now, if we save main.css and go back to the other terminal, notice that whenever we save this, it reloads. So the Vite development server is still running here. If we go back to the other terminal and let's install, or rather let's run the Django server, we can then go back to the browser and we can see the message of hello here, and we still get the console logs. Now, is Tailwind going to work with this process? Let's go back to VS Code and we're going to go to the base template. So base.html is where we're actually loading this asset. And we're going to target this body tag here and add some classes. Before we do that, I've noticed that there is actually a problem. So let's go back to the vite command. There was an error when starting the dev server here. And the problem that is occurring is related to this import here. And there's a very simple solution to this problem. We just need to rename the extension of the vite.config file. Rather than .js, it's going to be .mjs. Now, I don't want to derail this video by talking about this. It's just another peculiarity of JavaScript. But Node.js's original module import system used the require statement, and that's called common.js. But the more modern way of doing this uses these import statements, and that's module.js. So we can rename the extension here as .mjs in order to be able to use this import statement. So let's save this file and go back to base.html. And what I'm going to do just on the terminal at the bottom is clear this error. And let's try and rerun npm run dev here. That's going to start the Vite development server. And then if we go to the body tag here, we're going to target that with some classes. Now let's go back to the page here. Notice we have the hello statement. If we go back to VS Code and we're going to add a class to the body tag of background red 500. When we save this, we can go back to the page and it's automatically reloaded and we can see the red background. That's coming from that TailwindCSS class, and this is all now working. And if we add additional styles here, for example, we'll give it some padding and make the text 4XL and white. When we save this and go back to the page, notice that that has changed. So the hot reloading functionality of the Vite dev server is making this work without us having to reload the page manually. And in order to get this working with Django-vite, all we do is we specify an entry point here for the build process of main.js. And we also add the TailwindCSS plugin to the Vite config. And this is specific to Tailwind version 4. And then if we look at the entry point, notice that we're importing the CSS file here. And this CSS file contains that simple import of the TailwindCSS module. Now, if we actually want to look at what happens behind the scenes, we can run npm run and then the build command, which is going to run the Vite build command under the hood. And if we go to the assets directory and look at the manifest, notice that our entry point here is mapped to the JS file, but we also have this CSS block here, and that contains some CSS. Now, if we look at the Django assets directory here, we can actually look at the CSS as well as the JavaScript. And this is the final CSS that has been built and bundled using the rollup bundler that Vite uses under the hood. And if we go to the very end here, the classes that we've actually used, they are the ones that are included. So for example, we used that background red 500 class. That's part of this bundle. But for example, background red 800 is not going to be part because we didn't use that. So rather than including every single class from Tailwind, of which there are many thousands, we create this smaller subset, and that's going to be much more performant because it's going to reduce the size of the file that we're sending over the network to our clients. So that's the main benefit of using a build process like this rather than just including the files from a CDN, for example. That's going to include every single class by default, and that's probably not what you want in production. Now, the question you might be asking if you've seen how this worked before is how does Tailwind know which classes to include? Previously, we had a Tailwind config file that specified content blocks, and that would point to your Django HTML files or HTML files in whatever backend you're using, as well as JavaScript files and so on. But with Tailwind version 4, this has changed. So we've got a page here on automatic content detection. And as it says, previously we had that annoying content array in Tailwind version 3. But in version 4, they have come up with a bunch of heuristics for detecting all of that stuff automatically, so we don't have to figure it all out. Now, I'm not going to dive into all of this, but I'll leave a link to this page just below the video. But the benefit is that it's now much simpler to set this up with Vite or any other build tool. Now let's finish with a couple of quick things here. We're going to go back to the Vite config file, And I want to show how you can set aliases very quickly in this file. Now if we go to main.js, notice that we have here this import, and it uses the 2 dots to represent the parent directory. Now what we can do is we can specify an alias here for the root directory. And within this project, the static directory is where we have these assets. These are the raw assets that we want to use Vite to actually bundle and put into the assets directory. So what we can do is we can set an alias for this static directory. So rather than referring to these parent directories, we can just refer to the alias. And that's very useful if you have highly nested directories within that root. And you might have seen this in 𝗦𝐻.js projects, for example. Now all we need to do here is define a resolve block. And within the resolve block, we can define an alias here. So the alias I'm going to use is the @ symbol, and we can map that to a particular directory. So all I'm going to map it to is the static directory. So let me do that here. The static directory is where we're mapping that to, and that's what that's going to refer to in main.js. So what that means is that in the static directory, we have the CSS subdirectory. We can just replace this with the @ symbol, and everything should still work as expected. So let's go to the bottom here and rerun npm run dev. Just make sure that the dev server starts up successfully. And you can see that that is working. And if we go back here, we have the Django server running. Let's go back to the application, and you can see that everything is still working. And if we go back here and we run the build command, that's going to take those assets and build them into this assets directory, and everything should still be working. So that's how simple it is to set an alias using Vite here. And you might have seen this exact alias if you're using Next.js or React. I believe it's very common with those frameworks. Let's now move on to the final part of this video. And that is going to be about what happens in production. So if we go back to settings.py, let's say dev mode is set to false here. What that's going to do is essentially disable the Vite development server. So if we go to the terminal here and clear this out, if we try and run npm run dev, it's going to start that Vite server, but it's not going to work on the front end. So let's go back to our application here, and notice we now get this error, django-vite asset not found error. So basically it's looking in the manifest.json file for this particular file that we have, and that was the Vite asset that was defined in base.html using this template tag, but it's not finding that in the static root directory. So we end up getting this error. What can we do to fix this? What we need to do in production, of course, is we need to actually collect our static assets into the static root directory. So let's run a command here. It's going to be python manage.py collect static. And what that's going to do is bring all of the files in the different static directories in the Django application into that static root directory that can then be used in production to serve those assets. Now, if we go back to settings.py and scroll up here, the static root was the static files directory. And if we look in that directory, notice we now have a manifest.json file, and we also have the Django assets asset directory that was added that contains the CSS and the JS file. And with that, we can go back to the other terminal, and I'm going to stop the server and let's reload the Django development server. Once that's reloaded, we can go back to the browser. Now we had this error before. If we refresh this page, we're now going to see that everything is working. So we collected the static files into the static root directory. And if you're using django-vite in production, all you need to do is set the dev mode to false, and it's going to serve Django assets in the normal way and not using the Vite dev server. Now there's a lot more we could go over here, but that's going to be all for this video. This has been an overview on Django-vite and Vite.js and how you can use those applications within a Django project. And we've specifically looked at how we can use it with Tailwind version 4. If you want to support the channel and this content has been useful, check out the Ko-fi page that we've got just below the video. And we also have resources listed out there as well. And if you'd like to see any similar topics, let us know in the comments and we'll get them added very soon. Thanks again guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.